Okay, this evening we have with us a marketing expert. Jeffrey Candelaria is a native from Albuquerque, a graduate of UNM. He's the former vice president of marketing, membership, and corporate relations for one of the nation's largest chambers of commerce, the Albuquerque Hispano Chamber of Commerce, and former vice president for a regional bank. Having generated more than $15 million in direct sales, utilizing the principles of behavioral economics and the psychology of sales. Jeffrey is recognized as a proven business leader and a valued resource in Albuquerque. He is also, at this point, selling his 5-part sales video package, Generate Revenue by Living You as a Brand, and was recognized by Business First as one of the most business-connected people in Albuquerque. He has produced, coordinated, and hosted more than 300 business events and professional network exchanges and sales seminars. Jeffrey is the host of the Jeffrey Candelaria Radio Show, a business and opinion formatted radio show on KIVA Radio, 1600 AM, from Saturdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Mountain Time. And he has also recently launched his first historical novel, Toro, the Naked Bull, available on Amazon, and had like really outstanding, he was self-publishing, but had the best sales in the first week of anyone self-publishing I've ever seen. So Jeffrey, take it over.
Well, thank you, Rose. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, I'm Jeffrey Candelaria. And, I do want to thank you, Rose, not only for heading up this organization, but Rose helped me format, edit, sequence, build continuity to the book. And she was really my partner in that effort. It took me 13 years to complete. So as I do my presentation, I actually am feeling and experiencing what it's like to publish a book, to get it formatted, to get it sequenced, to maintain continuity, to get it into a place where you can sell it. So I'm somebody that's experiencing and personifying some of the things that all of you have experienced or are experiencing when it comes to selling your book. What I want to focus on is the psychology of sales and human motivation and the basic principles of behavioral economics. These are all just basically nomenclature that talks about what impels people to take action, to behave, to consume, or not consume. So it's going to be, I think, an interesting journey. I have a background in industrial psychology and behavioral economics, and I think that's why I've been able to be successful, because I try to study human behavior instead of just marketing from the perspective of who is your audience, what is my product, how do I link the two. We try to go a little bit deeper when it comes to the psychology of sales and behavioral economics and get into the psychographics of who you're selling to. And again, I don't want to get too technical, but I think it'll all be pretty obvious as we walk through these principles. So I'm going to start with the 7 human motivators, which again, impel all people to behave, to take action, to prioritize, to consume, that is to buy, including your books, hopefully. And then I'm also going to touch on the principles of behavioral economics, how people behave when they engage in an economic situation, buying a house, buying a book, buying a watch, whatever it is. And keep in mind, there's at least 2 pretty rudimentary dichotomies when it comes to the psychology of sales and behavioral economics. One is the frontal cortex part of our brain, which tends to look at making a purchase based on practical, pragmatic, analytical decision making. Okay, very important. But the limbic part of our brain in the back here, that's the emotion. That's, for example, someone who buys a Rolex watch. Do you really need a Rolex watch? Yes, it's practical and it tells time, but do you really need a Rolex watch? There's emotion based on that purchase, which I'm going to talk about, which represents one of the 7 motivators. So I just want you to keep those in mind as we move forward. I also teach a class in leadership economics, but obviously we can't touch on that today. I also have a couple of housekeeping items here. Thanks to my partners at Cello Grill, Revel Burger, and Pizza 9, we're going to give away two $30 gift certificates. Rose is going to have those at her office. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and whoever responds through the chat room will win a $30 gift certificate to Cello Grill, Pizza 9, and or Revel Burger, all local restaurants here in Albuquerque. Excuse me, I'd also like to remind you that Rose is going to be a guest on the Jeffrey Candelaria show in a couple of, I think in July, I forget the date, but we'll make sure that you're aware of when she's on so you can either podcast it or download the app or listen to it live, okay? So let's go ahead and begin. Again, my presentation, again, focuses on the psychology of sales and behavioral economics. Every one of you is a living brand based on your legacy, based on your behavior, based on what you're known for. So think about you as a brand. What do people say about you when you leave the room? That's basically your brand, whether you know it or not. That's the texture. That's the beginning to feel the psychology of sales based on branding. In most sales equations or training sessions, we tend to focus on our book, on our item, on our implement, on our service, but we tend to leave you out of the equation. And we also tend to leave out the psychographics or the psychology of who we're selling to. Yes, we understand who the market is based on maybe zip code, based on wealth, based on education, but do we ever really think about who we're selling to based on who you are as a brand, a living brand, and who you're selling to in terms of their behavior, in terms of their psychological profile? And again, there's no judgment here. It's just a matter of understanding the psychology of who you are as a brand, not just your book, and who you're selling to. I also want you to keep in mind as we go through this little journey tonight, have you sold a book to anyone before, or have you already built a sense of trust based on the content of your book, based on the emotion or loyalty you've built with those clients? So think about that. Have you sold books before, or have you not? Because if you haven't, it's going to be a little bit of a different process, and we can discuss that a little bit as well. So before I get into my actual visual presentation, I want you to think about the seven human motivators that motivate, impel our catalysts to behavior, taking action, not taking action, prioritizing behavior and taking action, and of course, whether people consume or buy something. There are seven motivators that all people travel when they make decisions to do anything in terms of behavior or to consume. The first one, people buy and consume, not all, based on ego and status. I am a very transparent person. I am a very authentic person. I'm comfortable with my skin. I grew up relatively poor in a very blighted part of Albuquerque. So now that I can afford nice things, I admit that I do buy things based on ego and status. I admit it. So if you're selling to me, you want to take note of that because it's something that I'm motivated by. And I don't apologize for that. Again, if you understand behavioral economics and who you're selling to, you can position your product and or service ethically to that kind of motivation. So the first motivator in the human condition, people buy and behave based on ego and status. The second motivator, people buy, consume, and behave based on community, social connection, and relationships. Why are we all a member of this SouthWest Writers Club, if you will, or association? Part of it is because we're learning the pragmatics of editing a book, copywriting a book, marketing a book, all of that. But there's a certain community here. There's a shared sense of experience. So understanding that second motivation, people buy into clubs, people engage in behavior based on community, social connection, and building relationships. That's also important to me as well, okay? The third motivator, again, which impels people to do things, behave, prioritize, consume, buy, is having a sense of purpose and a meaningful life. So people will do things, buy things, read things, engage in activity that further augments and underpins that person's sense of purpose and a meaningful life. The fourth motivator is reduction of uncertainty. People won't do anything if they don't feel safe. Remember Maslow's pyramid of hierarchy? I believe the first one is safety. If a person doesn't feel safe, they're not going to do anything. Think about what we've all experienced the last year and 2 months. We've been locked down because, again, there's obviously a world pandemic going on. So reduction of uncertainty. People like routine. People like to predict the future. That's why people like precise instruments. Think of a high-end car. Again, I'm not endorsing a car. I'm just saying people might buy a BMW, a Lexus, a Mercedes, whatever, partly because of status, but partly because it's a precise instrument and they can more readily predict that they can provide reliability of transportation. That's part of reduction of uncertainty. People like to predict the future as much as possible. I can't underscore how important safety and reduction of uncertainty is. That's why people engage in predictable, trustworthy relationships. They're reducing and mitigating suspicion of behavior. The fifth motivator, extraordinarily important to a lot of people, is personal development and personal challenge. So again, many of your books talk about personal development, challenging yourself, whether it's challenging your ethical profile, whether it's challenging your physical profile, whether it's challenging your sense of curiosity. So that sense of personal challenge and personal development is another extremely powerful motivator that impels people to do things and take action and prioritize. A sixth motivator for a lot of people, which this includes me, is adventure and challenge. So adventure and challenge are married in that regard. A lot of folks, and you know who they are, they're risk takers. So you have people on the spectrum of risk that are low risk takers, medium risk takers, high risk takers. So again, I'm not judging, I'm simply saying on the spectrum of adventure, people have a place on that spectrum. Where do you fit? Who do you sell to? Where are they on that sense of adventure spectrum? And then the final motivator that impels people to take action, prioritize, consume, buy, not take action, whatever, is, again, Sigmund Freud would love this, it's distraction from death and health. How many people that you know are obsessed with health? I'm obsessed with health. I admit it. So knowing that about me, you can already tell there's 3 things about Jeffrey, if you're selling me something, that you can ethically position to trigger my prioritization buttons when it comes to taking action and to purchasing. So again, those 7 motivators, ego, status, social connection, community relationships, purpose, a meaningful life, reduction of uncertainty, safety, personal challenge, personal development, adventure, risk, and distraction from death and health. People buy, consume, take action, prioritize, also remember in combinations. And generally, according to most behavioral psychologists, there are 3 or 4 of these that people combine when they do something. Very important to understand that. So now that you understand kind of the framework, the architecture of motivation, I want to get into some of the principles of behavioral economics. All right. So let's start with the first thing we're going to talk about is how do you get people's attention? How do you command attention to get people to pay attention to you, let alone buy your book, whatever that might be? Is that, and I'm asking that question in terms of how do you get people to pay attention to you in terms of your clients, in terms of people who advocate for you in your book and support you in your book, very important. And a lot of times advocates are not necessarily clients. The third genre might be, how do you get attention with your partners, with the folks that are going to be part of that network, bookshops, marketing entities, people like that. And again, the fourth piece to how do you get attention is partners. Think of radio hosts like myself, others like that. And what I would suggest, in order to get attention from any of these areas in the architecture of marketing, distribution, and sales, is bring a sense of relevance, value, and why should I care? Very important. So when you're commanding somebody's attention, are you commanding their frontal cortex? Are you commanding their emotion? Are you commanding both? But just keep that in mind. And generally people respond and give you attention, whoever you is, if you bring value to them, relevance, or some sense of emotion. Very important. The second, one of the other principles of behavioral economics is negotiating obvious things. I love this one because I detest cliche platitudes. I mean, I drive people crazy because Nancy, my wife, she might say, "Do you like? What do you like about my dress?" And most people say, "Oh, it's green or something." But I try to actually delve a little deeper into why I actually like her dress, and so I tend to over answer the question, but I try to address both the emotion aspect of that question and the pragmatics of the question. It fits well. The color aesthetically looks good on you, or it doesn't. But negotiating obvious things is extremely important. Like, for example, how do you ask people to support you in terms of buying your books, partnering with you to distribute your books, or to perhaps support you? How do you ask that question? Too many people that I've seen in the marketplace, not just here, but everywhere, say, "Oh, I just sold a book." Great. Why should I care? Always answer that question in the mind of the person you're selling to. Why should that person care? Now, again, remember I asked that question earlier. Have you sold a book before to that person or to that market? If you have, and I assume that your book was relevant in terms of content, in terms of some kind of relevance, and if it was, then you've already established some kind of a trust mechanism. But if you've launched a new book like I have, a lot of folks have obviously never purchased a book from me. A lot of folks have never purchased a book from you. So you have to establish relevance and trust, not only from you, but obviously from the book. Are you selling the book based on just content? Or are you asking the question, it would mean something to me, Rose, if you bought my book? You and I have a relationship, Rose. You helped me with a book. It would mean a lot to me if you purchased the book. Do you see where now I'm going from just the book and content to limbic, loyalty, trust, emotion? It would mean something to me if you bought the book. That's a very powerful question to ask a person, because you're putting them on an emotional precipice and they're going to have to make a decision. And usually that person will respond in favor, assuming that your brand, assuming that you have a trustworthy legacy, because it'll extrapolate into the book. You personify the book. You're a trustworthy person. You're an ethical person. I imagine the book is an extrapolation of that. And if you appeal to their emotion, generally people will respond in the positive. It's important that we review this part as well. Sustainable relationships mean that market is available to you when you have your sequel or your third book or your fourth book, your fifth, whatever, because it wasn't just a transactional relationship. You're executing sustainable relationships, which means relationships based on trust and ethics and relevance over time. Those are your repeat customers. Those are your supporters. Those are your partners. And basically, sustainable relationships are based more about you, your brand, your reputation, your legacy. what people think and say about you when you leave the room. So it's not just about your sequel. Generally, the sustainable relationships are going to be an extension of you, your brand, your legacy, your character. And that's extremely important because it's not just a transactional relationship. It's a sustainable one that's bigger than just the purchase of your book. So again, I know I'm going rather quickly, but these principles I think are obvious, self-evident, but I don't think we talk about them enough. Again, trust. When's the last time you had a session on trust? Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. I don't think we talk about trust enough. And again, trust is essentially based on a combination of practical execution, pragmatics, thinking, analysis that's married to emotion. So again, I go back to, I admit I bought a Rolex watch. So it's a frontal cortex precision instrument, but it's beautiful to me. So there's an emotional connection. So it does both. It married both. And again, the height of trust is when you generally can marry emotion and analysis. So you're marrying both parts of your brain to a service, to a product, to a relationship. And again, trust is also based on authenticity, sincerity, reduction of uncertainty. Think about people that you trust or items that you trust in your home, whatever that might be. They work, they're precise. You're almost mitigating any risk for the future because you trust that that thing is going to operate in the future. Or I can trust that if I call Rose, she's going to call me back. Or I trust that Rose is going to be at our next, meeting well prepared because that's who she is. It's not just what she does. So trust is bigger than just what we do as an execution. It's who we are or who the thing is. And again, I know I'm going kind of quickly, but it's important to understand that trust is composed of variables that have to also happen over time. And ultimately, the most trustworthy things are such that you have an analytical, predictable sense of reliability for this thing or person, but you also have the limbic or the emotional attachment to that. That's the height of trust, execution and emotion. This is important, I think, as well, when we're engaging in the sales process, when we're engaging in behavioral economics. It's managing expectations of your clients, your supporters, your partners, whomever you work with. It's also understanding not only what you expect, but what they expect beyond the transaction. And I always ask people, beyond my book, as an example, is there anything you expect of me beyond selling you the book? And a lot of people will say, I'd like you to sign the book. That's important. So now when you get somebody to sign the book, they've gone from the purchase of the book, the analytics of the book, to the emotion. Because think about it, a signature is a very personal thing. So when you can get people to sign your book or you sign their book that you sold them, you're getting into the emotional part of trust and emotional attachment to your book and to you as the author. That's extremely meaningful. So when you can talk about expectations beyond just the transaction, it's extremely meaningful because oftentimes we make assumptions about what people expect of us. That's why it's important to ask, what else do you expect of me in the sales process? Because you're going to get answers to that question that you may not have thought of. So just think about managing expectations. And keep in mind, I do individual trainings, and I have a 5-part video package that talks about all these things at length. Consistency, again, Consistency is one of the salient components that is the architecture of trust. People, remember we talked about this as a motivation, safety. Safety is mitigating uncertainty. Reduction of uncertainty is being consistent. That's the height of trust, consistency, being able to predict the future to the best of your ability. So your brand, your legacy is consistency. If you're a great author, your books are consistent, right? It's an extension of the work you put in to that brand, which is your book, which is an extension of who you are and your dynamic of trust. Consistency is power because it fuels your client base, your partner base, your advocate base. That's the essence of legacy as well, consistency. And also I want to talk about this word passion. Passion, again, is this emotional motivation. When you hear people say, oh, I'm very passionate about my artwork, I'm very passionate about writing, I'm very passionate about running, whatever it might be. Well, people use that word as a platitude. Let me go back to it. Sorry. Forgive me. All right. So passion, that emotional component in the limbic part of our brain, according to many behavioral psychologists, including the ones I subscribe to, is really based on three components. And again, I'm being quite rudimentary here, but I think it's important to at least understand some of the more salient pillars that make up this thing called passion. Because how many times do we hear people say, I'm passionate about something? Well, we become impervious to it, or we become dismissive of that word because we're really not talking about what it means. So what it really means is emotion married to conviction, married to action. So think about people that say, oh, I'm really passionate about going on a diet or working out or writing a book, but they don't do it. So they have an emotional commitment to it, but they don't have the conviction, which is the discipline of writing the book. It took me 13 years to complete my book, but thanks to Rose, and forgive me in terms of how I say this, but thanks to COVID, gave me some time, I practiced the conviction, the discipline of writing the book, and I took action. So passion generally is a combination of these three things. Without action, conviction, emotion by itself doesn't mean anything. Action and conviction without emotion, particularly sincerity, it doesn't mean much either. So think about passion as a combination of these three components: conviction, the discipline, the purpose, it stands for something, the action of doing it, and then the emotional component, which strikes to our limbic component of our brain. Very important. Relationships. How many people do you hear say, oh, I build relationships? I don't know what that means when people say that. So what I try to talk about when I build relationships are, I try to build relationships based on being ethical, clarity of intention and purpose. Again, are you intentional when you sell something? Are you intentional when you market something? Are you intentional when you're trying to accomplish something? Does it have purpose and conviction? I don't know. It probably does, but I think it's extraordinarily important to say out loud, I'm selling my book. I'm proud of my book. I'd like you to buy my book. I'm very clear about that. Thirdly, I try to build relationships based on trust, based on action. Again, remember we talked about earlier, how many people say, oh, I'm going to go on a diet, I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to run a marathon, I'm going to write a book, whatever. Well, you trust those people to be sincere about it, but did they take the action and trust? Did they marry the two? Because to me, that again is consistency, because people, that's what leadership is, okay? Leadership is those folks that you trust that take action for a greater good, conviction, based on ethics. And the other part of relationship building that I think is extremely important is to be authentic, to tell the inconvenient truth. So my truth is I'm provocative, I'm authentic, and I'm a no-nonsense guy. So if you want to deal with me, I let it be known that's who I am. That's not just what I do. So my persona, my nature, have any of you read the meditations of Marcus Aurelius? He was one of the great emperors, maybe about 200 years after Julius Caesar, after Augustus Caesar. Well, his meditations really kind of talked a lot about nature, knowing your nature. Whatever your nature is, if you're an empathetic person, personify empathy in all that you do based on trust and action, and your relationships will be completely transparent and authentic. Many of you are already doing these things instinctively. I'm just giving you the architecture of what it looks like, okay? So keep that in mind. Authenticity, we've talked about this. Honesty and authenticity are extraordinarily important if you want sustainable relationships and if you want to further your brand and your legacy. Again, a lot of you people are already doing this instinctively, but I'm only mentioning this out loud. Authentic people are people that we generally respect because they are basically marrying their nature to what they do. And that's what I try to do and teach in my classes, is integrating your nature, who you are, into what you do. That way you become consistent, transparent, trustworthy, and authentic. And you mitigate questions about who you are, what you do, because people can essentially predict behavior. Nothing wrong with that. And it becomes the height of trust if you can integrate authenticity into your business. And basically, if you have a book, you're in business. Culture. I like to talk about culture as your brand. Your brand is a culture. Your brand is a legacy. I worked at Disneyland in the early 90s, and I learned something really obvious about Disneyland, whether we like Disneyland or not. They do a pretty good job of branding. And they do three things, and they don't negotiate three things: safe, happy, clean. That's what Disneyland does. Everything that they do, everybody that they hire, everybody that they partner with, all that the rides that they create, all the imagery they create, at least on property. I can't speak for their filmmaking, but on property, they do three things. This is their culture: safe, happy, clean. If it's not those three things, Disneyland, at least in the early 90s, was not going to do that. And again, you are a living brand. My video series talks about that. Whether you know it or not, what people say about you when you leave the room is part of your culture, is part of your character, is part of your reputation, is part of your brand and legacy. And when you can orchestrate ethically your culture, your brand, based on your nature, then in my opinion, you become an excellent salesperson and brand leader and leader. Again, many people are already doing this instinctively, but I'm just mentioning this overall. Again, intention, very important, because intentionality engenders confidence, power in business and in life. When you're intentional about something, it engenders confidence and power, not just in terms of sales, but I just think it's very liberating overall. I'm a very intentional person, and a lot of people don't necessarily like that about me, but I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to serve a purpose in whatever I might be doing. So I'm very intentional with that purpose, because intention, trust, and sustainable relationships, frankly, are bigger than being liked. Think about that. Think about a dentist or somebody. Do you necessarily like your dentist? I don't know, but maybe your dentist is intentional and very purposeful in what he or she does. You trust them because they're intentional about their work. It's not just about liking. And our society has become fixated with liking and approving. Well, that really doesn't, according to my work and my experiences, liking and approval are really pretty transitory things in the final analysis. And again, intention, authenticity, trust is a discipline that requires time. It requires being congruent over time by, again, integrating consistency, confidence, and power. But I think it's so important, intentionality in all that we do. I just want to mention this because it's something that I think is important. When we're selling something, according to behavioral psychologists, and again, I'm just going over some of the principles quickly, it's best to try to sell something wherever that time zone is, whether it's Moscow, Tokyo, Kuala Lumpur, New York, London, Taos, whatever, sometime between 8 and 11 a.m. Here it says 10 a.m., but it's about 8 to 11 a.m. because people after noon or the lunch hour or later in the day tend to be limbically tired, emotionally spent, and analytically tired. So I'm just saying, generally speaking, if you have something, particularly a presentation like this one, if you can do it in the morning, generally people are a little bit more alert. Again, that's not to say people aren't going to consume, buy, pay attention, and be moved by things that you do if you do it later in the day. I'm just saying, keep in mind day part when you're executing a presentation. Okay, just keep that in mind. Day parts are important. Social media, macro presentation. Again, before you engage with a partner, look in their social media account. Are they on Facebook? I mean, again, these are obvious things, but it's important that you do some preparation because a lot of people, you can tell more about their brand, what they want you to know about them on social media. Think about what I just said. A lot of people will put forth, I just had a salad and a steak Diane at, Frenchie's restaurant in Paris. Look at my lunch. I mean, who does that? So if you dissect that further, they want to reveal something about them to you on social media. So again, without judging anything, what a person reveals about themselves on their Facebook page, as an example, says a lot about what they want you to think about them. A very obvious thing, but it's, I think, important if you're going to prepare to work with a partner or someone, look at their social media page. It will reveal a lot about what they want you to think and know about them. The power of three. And again, I'm just going to go over this briefly. According to behavioral psychologists, if you have a presentation of some kind, or if you have 3 versions of your book, it's better than 2, and it's better than 4, and it's better than 1. When you have 2 versions of something, 2 presentations, 2 options, people tend to feel guilty if you only give them 2 choices. But if you give them 3, it tends to mitigate that sense of personal guilt. Again, this is just how the mind generally works, or how the brain works. So just think about, if you have presentations in the future, think about the power of 3. 4 tends to be too much. 1, of course, isn't giving anybody an option, so they don't feel that there's a democratic process going on. If you give somebody 2 choices, they tend to feel guilty.
This is Jeff Candelaria. He's talking.
Yes, Pat? Patricia, yes? Did you say something?
No.
Oh, sorry. So just think about the power of 3 when you're making presentations. Again, as I begin to conclude here, a repeatable business model is important. People like routine. People like predictability. They like to predict the future based on trust. So try to create a business model that's repeatable and transferable to the best of your ability. And don't forget to listen to the Jeffrey Candelaria Show. And I'm going to take questions, but we're going to give away a